Rain poured relentlessly onto the cracked sidewalks of Atlanta, blurring the neon signs and soaking the streets in silver threads. The night was thick with the smell of wet asphalt and the low hum of distant traffic. Amara pulled her worn jacket tighter around her frame, her steps slow, heavy, and deliberate as she made her way home from the late shift at the diner. Her feet throbbed in cheap sneakers that had long since lost their grip, and her stomach clenched in sharp, hollow pangs that she'd learned to ignore. In her bag, wrapped carefully in a paper sack, was a single take-out meal, a luxury she'd managed to scrape together from her meager tips. It wasn't much, but it was supposed to be dinner for both herself and her daughter, Maya. As she crossed under the flickering glow of a street lamp, she noticed him. A man sat hunched on the curb, soaked to the bone, his thin frame trembling. In the cold, his clothes clung to him like wet paper, his shoes threadbare, his face hollow with hunger and exhaustion. Passers-by swept past him like the rain, heads down, eyes averted, as though he were nothing but another crack in the sidewalk. Amara slowed, hesitated, her gaze caught on him. Something about the way he sat, rigid yet defeated, gnawed at her. She didn't have enough for herself. Not tonight, not really. But she knew the deeper ache of empty bellies, of counting coins and skipping meals to stretch one more day. She knew what it meant to be invisible. Her pulse quickened as she stepped toward him, the rain soaking through to her skin. The man noticed her movement and looked up, startled, as if unaccustomed to being seen. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, flickered with suspicion and then confusion when she held out the bag toward him. Here, she said softly, her voice nearly drowned by the hiss of the rain. He stared at her, his mouth slightly open, not moving to take it at first. Why? He asked, voice raspy from disuse, a tremble in the single word that betrayed his disbelief. Amara's lips curved into a small, tired smile, the kind that comes from someone who has very little left to give, but still gives anyway. Someone has to care, she murmured, as though it were the simplest truth in the world. For a heartbeat. The rain was the only sound between them. Then, with trembling hands, he accepted the bag as though it might vanish. His throat bobbed, a rough breath escaping him, but no words followed. Amara didn't wait for gratitude. She just turned and kept walking, her footsteps splashing through shallow puddles, her body weighed down by more than fatigue. The city around her remained indifferent, swallowing the moment whole. She crossed intersections slick with oil and rain, past boarded-up storefronts and sagging brick buildings until she reached her own. A crumbling apartment complex where the security lights no longer worked and the elevators had been broken for months. She climbed the stairs slowly, muscles aching with every step. Inside her small, cluttered unit, the air was cool and still. Maya, only 5 years old, lay curled on the thin mattress they shared, clutching a fraying stuffed rabbit. Her soft breaths rose and fell in the rhythm of deep sleep. Amara's heart softened as she watched her, brushing damp curls from the child's forehead. She sank down beside her daughter, the ache in her stomach gnawing deeper now, but she ignored it. Hunger was nothing new. Loneliness wasn't either. She pressed a kiss to Maya's temple and wrapped her arms around her, drawing warmth from the small, sleeping body as though it could fill all the hollow places inside her. Amara didn't know that tonight's simple act, that fleeting decision beneath the rain, would ripple through time in ways she couldn't imagine. She didn't know that the man under the streetlight, the one she fed without expectation, would remember her name long after the world forgot her face. Asterisk for now. There was only the rain, the dark, and the quiet weight of survival. Asterisk and still. Despite everything, she chose to care. Asterisk Amara's life had been a slow, grinding collapse long before the rain-soaked night when she handed away her only meal. The descent began years earlier, sharp and brutal, when she found herself staring at a pregnancy test at 19, her hands shaking, her heart galloping inside her chest like it was trying to outrun her fate. The father, a boy she had loved, with the kind of desperate, blinding hope only teenagers possess, had disappeared as soon as she whispered the words, "I'm pregnant." His promises, his soft words, all vanished like mist under the weight of responsibility. But it was her own family's rejection that hollowed her out the most. Asterisk Margaret Amara's mother, a woman with the social sharpness of a blade and a reputation she protected like crown jewels, had responded with cold finality. Amara's swollen belly was, in her words, an unspeakable shame, an irreparable stain on the family name. It didn't matter that Amara begged to stay, promised to find a way to fix things, promised she could still make something of herself. Margaret had already made her choice. With a steely glare and a clipped goodbye, she severed Amara from the life she had known, the manicured lawns, the private schools, the holidays in Europe, all gone in an instant. Her father barely looked at her. Her brother Daniel had lingered in the doorway, guilt pooling in his eyes, but he hadn't said anything then. None of them had. Asterisk the years since had been a relentless battle against the tide. Amara scraped by, doing whatever work she could find. Waitressing became her anchor, but the long hours, the exhaustion, and the humiliations piled on her like a weight she could never shrug off. Her boss, a man who smirked when he cornered her in the stockroom, and whispered crude invitations, made her skin crawl. She needed the job too badly to risk a confrontation. Every shift was a tightrope walk. Every paycheck was already spent before she received it. She was months behind on rent. The threat of eviction clung to her like a shadow. Some nights she stared at the ceiling, wondering how much longer she could keep this fragile life from crumbling completely. Asterisk her daughter. Lila, now 7, was the brightest point in her world. A little girl with wild curls, clever eyes, and an imagination that could light up the dimmest room. But even Lila had begun to notice the weight of their circumstances. She'd started asking why her clothes didn't look like the other girls at school, why their dinners were sometimes only toast or soup from a can. She had come home crying more than once, confessing that the other children laughed at her worn shoes and the patches on her backpack. Each tear from Lila stabbed at Amara's chest in a way that exhaustion and hunger never could. Asterisk Amara's mother still lived comfortably, sealed away in her immaculate home within a pristine gated community where reputation meant more than flesh and blood. She hadn't spoken to Amara in years, as though the silence would somehow erase her daughter's existence. Amara sometimes wondered if her mother even knew Lila's name. If she cared, the answer gnawed at her. Daniel, her younger brother, was the only thread that remained, though even that thread was fraying. He would sometimes sneak her small envelopes of cash, left quietly under her apartment door or tucked inside a coffee cup when they met in secret. But his loyalty had limits, tethered by fear of their mother's wrath. He never stayed long, always watching over his shoulder, always racked with guilt that he couldn't do more. Asterisk the walls were closing in on Amara from every direction. The landlord had stopped leaving polite notices and had begun pounding on her door with ultimatums. At the diner, her boss's advances became harder to evade, his frustration simmering dangerously. Lila's sadness at school deepened, the weight of poverty pressing against her tiny shoulders. Amara felt like she was sprinting through quicksand, giving everything she had, but still sinking. The exhaustion wasn't just in her body anymore. It lived in her bones, her breath, the corners of her mind where hope used to live. She lay awake most nights, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the sound of Leela breathing beside her. She couldn't afford to fall apart. She didn't have the luxury of despair. There was no one coming to save her, no family, no safety net, only her own will to keep moving, to endure one more day, one more shift, one more skipped meal. But, deep down, a quiet fear gnawed at her. What would happen when there was nothing left to give? And yet, she got up every morning. She braided Lila's hair with shaking hands. She tied the worn laces of her shoes and faced the day with a grit born not from confidence, but from sheer necessity. Amara had already lost everything that used to define her, but she still had Lila, and for her daughter she would keep standing, even as the world tried to pull her to her knees. The paper flapped violently on the apartment door, barely clinging to the chipped wood as the wind tugged at its corners. Amara knew what it was before she touched it. The bold, unforgiving letters screamed eviction notice across the top, a brutal punctuation to the slow collapse she'd been fighting for months. Her throat tightened as she read the details, the deadline scrawled in red ink like a death sentence. She had no more time, no more chances. Inside, Leela sat cross-legged on the thin rug, carefully stitching the ear back onto her stuffed rabbit with a needle Amara had given her. From the sewing kit they rarely used anymore, Leela's small voice floated through the cracked apartment, humming to herself, blissfully unaware of the new disaster waiting just outside the door. Amara's legs threatened to buckle, but she couldn't let Lila see her fall apart. Not yet, not here. She crumpled the paper in her fist and shoved it deep into her coat pocket, forcing a steady breath as she crossed the room to kneel beside. Her daughter. "How about grilled cheese for dinner?" she asked, stretching her voice into something that sounded like hope. The landlord didn't bother with pretense when she confronted him later that evening, his voice dripping with satisfaction, as he reminded her she was 3 months behind, that sympathy wasn't part of their lease agreement. "You've had your chances, sweetheart," he sneered, his gaze crawling over her like something oily. "Maybe if you were a little more accommodating, we could work something out." Amara's stomach churned with a sick, burning rage, but she swallowed it, knowing she was out of options. His door slammed in her face before she could even finish pleading. Desperation wrapped itself around her throat as she stared down the empty hallway, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing in her ears. She had never wanted to take the next step, but the weight of Leela's needs crushed whatever pride she had left. By the next morning, she was standing at the gates of the home she hadn't seen in nearly 8 years. The wrought iron still gleaming, the hedges still perfectly trimmed. Nothing had changed except the deep, bitter ache in her chest. When the housekeeper reluctantly let her in. The scent of polished wood and expensive perfume dragged her straight back to a life that no longer belonged to her. The family was gathered. In the sitting room, their posturing stiff and immaculate as always. Her mother's expression was carved from ice the moment their eyes met. Amara tried to keep her voice steady as she explained the eviction, the bills, the hopeless spiral. "I'm not asking for forever," she said, her voice cracking despite herself. Just a little help to get back on my feet. For Leela, asterisk, but Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't soften. She made no move to shield this shameful exchange from the family members who sat in silent, comfortable judgment. You made your bed, her mother said coldly, her words sharp and deliberate. And now you're here, a beggar, asking for scraps. You are a failure, Amara. You've always been one. Asterisk, Daniel stirred, his voice hesitant but pushing through. Mom, asterisk enough, Margaret snapped, silencing him with a look that froze the air. Asterisk Amara's heart fractured as she turned to leave, her steps hollow against the marble floor. Just as she crossed the threshold, her mother's parting words drifted after her, soft but cutting. Sometimes, some people are meant to suffer. Asterisk the phrase clung to her like smoke, filling her lungs as she stumbled back out into the cold. She couldn't feel the rain this time, couldn't even feel her own body as she walked the long road home. The thoughts slipped into her mind so easily, so quietly. Maybe Lila deserved more than this life she was clawing to hold together. Maybe giving her up to foster care would offer her a chance Amara could never provide. The idea horrified her, but it also flickered with the cruel logic of desperation. Would that be love, too? Letting her go, asterisk, her breath hitched, and she pressed her back against a damp brick wall, sliding down until the cold bit into her skin. The tears came hard and fast, but somewhere beneath them, something else stirred. Not just sorrow, but fury. Asterisk, no one was coming to save them. No one ever had. But that didn't mean she would surrender. Something inside her snapped into place. Like a locked door, not shutting out the world, but barricading her resolve. She wouldn't crawl anymore. She wouldn't beg. She would fight. For Leela, for herself, for every inch of dignity they tried to strip from her. Even if she had to fight alone, the days bled into each other, a relentless churn of exhaustion and quiet desperation. After the eviction scare, Amara clawed her way into more work. Anything she could find, stacking triple shifts like sandbags against a flood. When her hours at the diner weren't enough, she scrubbed office buildings at night, dragging heavy carts of cleaning supplies down endless hallways until her arms trembled and her back screamed. Her hands cracked and bled from the harsh chemicals, but she wrapped them in bandages and kept going. Sleep became a luxury she could no longer afford. Meals turned into crusts of bread and the forgotten scraps she pocketed during her shifts. The ache in her bones deepened, settling into her chest like a weight she carried without question. There was no space for rest, no margin for error. Asterisk still, the ground beneath her kept shifting. One afternoon, her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. Lila's school. The words sliced through her like broken glass, suspended, fighting when she arrived. She found Lila sitting alone on the cracked bench outside the principal's. Office arms crossed, chin trembling but stubbornly tilted high. The teacher's voice droned on about rules and discipline, but Amara barely heard it. Lila had lashed out at the kids who teased her about her clothes again. The same second-hand dresses, the shoes with the peeling soles. Asterisk in the silence of their walk home, Amara tried to keep her voice calm, tried to ask the right questions, but Lila only shrugged, her gaze fixed on the pavement. "It doesn't matter," she mumbled. "They'll always think I'm nothing." Asterisk the words landed like a knife in Amara's chest. When they reached their apartment, she locked herself in the bathroom, pressing a towel to her mouth to stifle the sobs that clawed their way out. Her daughter, the bright, curious little girl she fought so hard for, was starting to lose hope too. Asterisk, just when the walls seemed to be closing in completely. An envelope appeared in their mailbox, plain. No return address. Inside was a receipt from the leasing office. 3 months' rent, paid in full. Tucked into the corner was a small, handwritten note. Someone cared for me when I was forgotten. Asterisk Amara stared at the words, turning them over in her hands, unsure. If it was some cruel joke or a miracle too fragile to believe. But it didn't stop there. A week later, a package arrived. New clothes for Leela, in her favorite colors. A grocery delivery followed. Bags filled with fresh fruit, milk, bread, more food than their fridge had held in months. Each time, the same note appeared, nothing more. Someone cared for me when I was forgotten. Asterisk, the mystery gnawed at her. But so did the relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could exhale, even just a little. She used the food to cook proper meals. She braided Leela's hair in the mornings and saw the faint return of her daughter's smile. A flicker of light trying to reignite. But the world had a way of punishing small joys. Her mother heard whispers, the rent paid, the packages, the sudden stability. Margaret's mind leapt to the ugliest conclusion. One morning, Amara found herself cornered outside a small market, her mother's cutting voice sharp enough to draw blood. So this is what you've become, trading yourself for handouts. The words echoed across the sidewalk, sharp and loud enough to draw stares from strangers. Margaret's disdain wasn't quiet, wasn't hidden. She wanted Amara to feel the weight of the shame she was so eager to assign. Asterisk, you think you're better now because someone's tossing you scraps. I suppose you've finally found your price. Asterisk, Amara stood frozen, her fists clenched so tightly her nails dug crescent moons into her palms. She didn't answer. There was no point. Margaret's cruelty was practiced, perfected. Daniel was there, watching, but powerless as always. Later, when no one was looking, he pressed a folded wad of bills into Amara's palm and whispered that he was sorry. His help was quiet, trembling, but it mattered. He was the only one who hadn't fully abandoned her. Asterisk, the pressure kept mounting, suffocating her from all sides. Her boss, at the diner, emboldened by her desperation, made his offer clear one night. Job security, overtime shifts all hers, in exchange for one night with him. His voice oozed with false sympathy as he laid out the bargain, the price tag dangling in the air between them. Asterisk, for a moment, the weight of survival almost broke her resolve. She thought of Leela, of the rent, of the endless hours clawing for pennies. For a sickening heartbeat, she almost said yes, but the taste of surrender was already bitter in her mouth. With her hands shaking, her heart hammering against her ribs, she looked him in the eye and told him no, not like this. Asterisk, the fallout was immediate. He fired her on the spot, his sneer sharp and satisfied as he reminded her what she'd just thrown away. Amara walked out into the cold with her head held high, but her stomach twisted with fear. She had stood her ground, but the cost felt like it might drown her. Asterisk, the anonymous gifts continued, but the steady collapse of her body could not be delayed. Her days became even longer, her nights even more brutal as she juggled cleaning shifts and temp jobs to scrape together what she could. Asterisk then. One night, as she crossed a familiar street on her way home from yet another exhausting shift, her vision blurred, the world tilted, her knees buckled, and the ground rushed up to meet her. The last thing she heard was the distant thud of footsteps and the clatter of her keys hitting the wet pavement before everything went dark. Asterisk, her body had finally given out, but the fight inside her, the fierce, stubborn blaze that had kept her moving, was still burning, refusing to be snuffed out. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled Amara's nose as she slowly drifted back into consciousness. The harsh white light of the hospital ceiling flickered overhead, the steady beep of a heart monitor the only sound tethering her to the moment. Her body ached in places she didn't know could hurt. For a brief, terrifying second, she panicked, "Where's Lila?" But then a soft, steady voice pulled her back. Asterisk, "You're safe now." Asterisk, Amara's eyes fluttered open, her gaze focusing on the man sitting beside her bed. He was sharply dressed, his tailored suit far removed from the ragged layers she remembered. But it was his eyes that caught her breath, the same haunted, grateful eyes from that rainy night so long ago. Asterisk James, he said softly, as though offering his name for the first time. You may not remember me. Years ago, you gave me your only meal. You sat it beside me like I was human when no one else would even look at me. Asterisk, the memory flooded back in a rush. The rain, the shivering man, her own growling stomach. She remembered his disbelief, the trembling way he had asked why she would give him her only food. And she had told him, simply, someone has to care. Asterisk, that moment changed everything. James continued, his voice steady but his hands clenched tight in his lap. I was ready to give up that night. I had decided it was over. But your kindness made me believe, just for a second, that maybe I didn't have to stay forgotten. Asterisk, his story spilled out. How he found a shelter, got sober, found a job at a local non-profit. How that job led him to people who believed in him, mentors who opened doors, and how, through years of brutal work and sheer will, he built his own company, a tech firm that had since exploded into a thriving enterprise. He hadn't just survived. He had risen, and all along, he had never forgotten her. It was you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't even know your name that night, but I never stopped looking. I found you 2 years ago, but I wanted to help without crowding you. The rent, the groceries, the clothes for Lila, that was me. Asterisk, Amara's throat tightened. Gratitude, shock, and disbelief tangled inside her. She tried to sit up, but he gently urged her to rest. Why? She whispered, the question cracking under the weight of everything. Asterisk, his smile was soft, but firm. Because kindness doesn't need to be repaid. But now it's my turn to care. Asterisk, from his briefcase, he pulled out 2 documents. One was a job offer, director of community outreach at his foundation. A role that would give her the stability and purpose she'd fought for all along. The second was the deed to a house, fully paid. Not a handout, he told her, but a gift freely given. One she had unknowingly earned years before. Asterisk, overwhelmed, Amara initially refused, her walls instinctively rising to shield her from the possibility. Of grace, she wasn't the type of person who got saved. She had taught herself that. But James met her resistance with patience. You didn't ask for anything that night, he reminded her. You gave when you had nothing. Let someone give. To you now. Asterisk, his words cracked something deep inside her. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to say yes. Asterisk, when James later invited her to a major company gala one, celebrating the foundation's expansion and honoring its key contributors, Mara reluctantly agreed to attend. She didn't know that her mother would be there, an honored guest among Atlanta's elite. Her social image carefully curated and fiercely protected. Asterisk, the night unfolded in grand halls draped with silver and glass. But all the opulence faded when James took the stage and began to speak. He told his story, not the sanitized version, but the raw, brutal truth of his fall and his climb back. And then he spoke of her. He described the nameless woman who saved him with one small act of decency, who fed him when she herself was starving. He painted a picture of her strength, her relentless love for her daughter, her refusal to surrender even as life beat her down. He called her the cornerstone of his recovery, the reason he was alive to stand before them. Amara's name echoed through the hall as James publicly honored her, calling her his friend, his hero. And when the screens behind him flashed images, a photo of Amara's crumpled eviction notice, a recording of Margaret's venomous words about some people being meant to suffer, the room stiffened. Gasps rippled through the crowd as her mother's cruelty was laid bare in front of her. Polished social circle. Margaret's carefully constructed world fractured in a single moment, her reputation collapsing under the weight of her own recorded contempt, her face drained of color, her lips parted in silent horror as the audience slowly turned against her. But what shattered Amara most wasn't her mother's humiliation, it was Daniel. For the first time, he found his voice. He stood up, trembling but resolute, and called out the years of silence, the generational shame, the cold walls their family had built. He chose his sister in front of everyone. Amara didn't need vengeance. She didn't crave her mother's ruin. All she had ever wanted was to know she mattered. And now, surrounded by people who finally saw her, who stood with her, she realized she had already won. Her story wasn't about revenge. It was about survival, about breaking the cycle, about choosing to care even when no one else would. Life didn't transform overnight, but it shifted in steady, quiet ways. Amara and Lila moved into their new home, a small but beautiful place, with sturdy walls, warm sunlight, and a front door that finally belonged to them. The hum of stability settled into their mornings. There was food in the fridge, books on the shelves, fresh sheets on the beds. Lila's laughter returned, light and unguarded, filling rooms that had once known only silence. For the first time, Amara could breathe without feeling the crushing weight of fear pressing against her ribs. She threw herself into her new role. At James's foundation, pouring her energy into building outreach programs for women and families on the brink. People whose struggles mirrored her own. The work was hard, but it filled her with purpose. She was no longer just surviving. She was leading, lifting others. With steady paychecks came something even rarer, the freedom to dream. Amara enrolled in evening classes at a local community college, carefully balancing her job, her studies, and motherhood. She sat in classrooms with younger students, her notebooks filled with furious scribbles and long-forgotten equations. She wasn't chasing a distant fantasy. She was investing in herself, one late-night assignment at a time. Slowly, the shame she had worn like a second skin began to peel away. She started to see herself not as a failure clawing her way through life, but as a woman who had fought for her place and earned it. Her mother's downfall rippled through Atlanta's social circles with quiet finality. Margaret was left to watch her carefully built image crumble as friends distanced themselves. Her cruelty no longer hidden behind country club gates and manicured hedges. But Amara found no satisfaction in the fall. Her mother's exile no longer held power over her life. Some people would carry their coldness to the grave, she realized. It wasn't her burden to carry anymore. Asterisk, what mattered was the family she was choosing to build. Daniel, free from his mother's suffocating grip, severed ties with Margaret and returned to Amara's life without pretense. They began to rebuild their fractured sibling bond, sharing childhood memories that had once been steeped in pain but now carried a bittersweet tenderness. He showed up for Leela too, sliding easily into the role of the uncle he had always wanted to be. The walls that once separated them began to crumble, brick by brick, until something like family grew in their place. Asterisk, but perhaps the most profound shift came in the quiet moments. When Amara retraced her steps through the streets she used to walk alone. One crisp autumn afternoon, she returned to her old neighborhood, moving through the familiar avenues where hardship had carved itself into her bones. The diner still sat on the corner, unchanged. The cracked sidewalks, the sagging bus benches, they were all the same, but she was not. She carried herself with the ease of someone who no longer flinched at shadows. Asterisk, she walked past the streetlight, where she had first met James all those years ago. Beneath it, a man huddled against the cold, his clothes worn thin, his hands trembling. As he clutched his coat tighter, the scene was achingly familiar, a perfect echo of that distant rainy night. Amara didn't hesitate. She reached into the paper bag she had carried with her freshly made sandwiches. A warm container of soup and placed the meal gently beside him. Asterisk, the man looked up at her, bewildered by the simple act of being seen. Asterisk, she offered him the same soft, broken smile she had once given to James. Someone has to care, she said, her voice steady, her heart full. Asterisk, she didn't stay for thanks or explanations. She walked away, not because she didn't care, but because she finally understood. Kindness moves forward. It multiplies, circles back, and touches lives long after we've left the moment behind. Asterisk, Amara had spent so many years believing she was invisible, that her worth was tied to suffering, but she now knew the truth. She wasn't defined by her mother's rejection or by the weight of poverty. She was defined by the way she chose to keep caring, even when no one cared for her.